Hello there. Welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Molly. And this week we are getting back to our CARS skills workshops with Jack himself. Jack, super excited to be back here with you for the second episode of this new series we're doing.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I had a lot of fun on the last episode, and I hope it was really informative. And I'm excited to dive deep into different passages with you.
Yes. Yeah. So if you missed our last CARS reading skills workshop, basically our goal here is to go through one of our CARS daily passages. In fact, this is the passage that goes live today, right? The day that this is posted. And we're going to go through it sentence by sentence, making sure that we are truly understanding what we're reading and pointing out the sentences that really carry the most weight in the passage so that we can learn to evaluate these passages critically when it comes to test day. We had a
Awesome.
lot of fun in our first episode. And in this passage, we're going through a pretty different topic from what we talked about before, which should be fun.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this passage is it's pretty much the exact opposite. Like the last
Mhm.
passage you read, you can understand every sentence. I think most people can, but this one is a little harder to read, and there's really little context. We don't understand the exact like what they're talking about, but you don't need to. That's the thing about the car section is it's an intimidating section where you assume that you're missing something and that you need to understand it prior to reading this passage. And that's not the case. Everything you need is in this passage. You don't need outside context or details. However, having that outside context could help you, but it could also hurt you because if you know too
Hmm.
much, you could bring in a bias, right? And so the best advice I can give anyone is when you're reading this, assume you don't know anything and just focus on whatever the author is saying, right? And if you do that, then you're going to be fine.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Leave everything about you at the door when you sit down to read Cars. So take Jack's advice into account here, right? Take a second, clear your brain of all your own thoughts, feelings, experiences, and perspectives, all your biases gone. And let's engage with this passage from sentence number one. So, hopping in, again, this is the daily passage from today, which will be
14.
April 14th, and it's called the Horatii.
Right.
So, morally, the story of the Horatii, triplet brothers who fought a duel to end a war and protect Rome, might seem like a strange choice for subject or of subject for Jacques Louis David to depict. So we're kind of understanding the basis of this story, but our actual argument here in our first sentence seems to be that this story of the Horatii is kind of an odd choice to presumably put in a painting or a sculpture or some sort of form of art.
Yeah, yeah. And so, how did you know that? Like, how did you get the idea that this is art?
It just seems with the word depiction. Again, I don't want to make assumptions on exactly what this is, but we do get this individual that is depicting this story in some way.
Right. Yeah. So, art could be in any form, right? Even a story like a poem is art, technically, right?
Hmm.
We don't know exactly what this thing is that like what they're putting on, right, to depict, but it is obviously something that they're recreating, right? They're redoing something in a new novel way. So that's a great point. There's a lot to unpack in this sentence. There's so much, and I'll kind of like break it down by clause. So morally, the story of the Horatii, that's I think how you pronounce it. There's a story. We don't know the story of the Horatii. Now, after you read this passage with us, go ahead and Google story of Horatii just so you can understand it, and then go back and read this passage. And I bet you it's going to make a lot more sense. However, what I want you to realize is you don't need to know the story in order to go through this passage. So we know there's a story. Triplet brothers. That's not difficult to visualize and understand. So these three brothers, they're triplets, meaning they're born at the same time, right? Who fought a duel is it's interesting because when we think of a duel, we think of like a one-on-one battle. So are these three individually battling one-on-one with three other people? Is that what's happening? It's hard to know, but it's okay because we know what a duel is. A duel is like a fight, right? Some sort of fight. That's good enough to end a war. Okay, so these three brothers are fighting to end a war and protect Rome. All right, so we can assume they're probably from Rome, right? They represent Rome because they're trying to protect Rome, or at least they're affiliated with Rome in some way. Might seem like a strange choice of subject. So this is a strange choice. So this is strange for whoever Jacques Louise David is, of subject. Subject meaning they're like David, the last name here, is portraying these individuals, right? This situation. And so, yeah, that was great. So basically, the story of brothers fighting to end a war, right, is weird, right? Strange for David to draw or depict in some way, whatever that word means in this context, in this case. Okay, great.
Cool. Yeah, I'm on the hunt for why it's so strange.
Right.
Let's see what our next sentence says. It says, from the point of view widely held in the 18th century, the story as told by Livy and illustrated by David in his first sketch of the subject can hardly have shown Roman virtue at its most exemplary. Okay, so this sentence is a little bit convoluted, right? It sounds like we're saying it doesn't show Roman virtue. We're bringing in other people who told this story, but it seems like we're continuing to argue that this was an odd choice. That's what I'm getting from this. Jack, how about you?
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, there's so like this is the sentence that most students will read and they'll just give up on this passage,
Yeah.
right? They'll go, okay, not for me.
Mhm.
For the next passage, we'll come back to this at the end, or
Mhm.
they will go back and read the first sentence over again, right? Because they feel like they're missing something. Don't do that. Just pick up whatever you can, right? And Molly, I think you're absolutely right. Like it's just continuing on in the same kind of direction, but kind of giving us a little bit of context as to why it's strange, right? 'Cause it
Mhm.
hardly shows virtue, Roman virtue at its exemplary, right? Most exemplary. That's good enough, right? It's still saying it's kind of weird because it's not doing what maybe it should have been doing, which is showing Roman virtue. I don't know what Roman virtue is or what exactly
Mhm.
it's referring to, but it's weird because of that. But if we want to break down the sentence and you really want to understand it, here we go. From the point of view widely held in the 18th century. So there's some point held in the 18th century, so sometime in the 1700s. The story as told by Livy. So Livy told this story. What story? The story of the Horatii, right? The brothers fighting, right? And illustrated. We already know illustrated means depict in a way by David. So David is that person that we were talking about in the first sentence that made some sort of depiction. In his first sketch, now we know. What is David depicting? This story in what form?
Sketch, right? Some art,
Some art, some
drawing.
it's some drawing. You sketch drawings, right? So now we know of the subject. So same subject, the whole story and this and the brothers can hardly have shown Roman virtue. Again, I don't know what Roman virtue means, but Roman virtue sounds like a good thing, right? Something that we aspire to, at
Mhm.
its most exemplary. So basically, it's saying, giving us more context that Livy was the one who came up with the story, or said the story. David sketched it, right? Didn't really explain Roman virtue. So again, really difficult to understand, but nothing really came out as obviously important, right? It's just more filler, right? And you will see a lot of filler for harder passages. That's a good thing. The harder the passage, the less important information there is typically, and usually the shorter the passage. And harder passages have easier questions on average, right? And so I pray that you guys get hard passages because I think those are easier, right? As long as you know this trick of, hey, let's not panic and let's continue, you're going to end up doing a lot better than you expect, right? Go ahead.
Love that. Okay. Livy himself pointed out that Horatius, Horatius was, in quotes, held more in admiration for his valiant exploits than for the justice of his cause. End quote. So here we're getting a direct quote from Livy, who we know is the person who was originally telling this story. And maybe here we're learning a little bit about what they meant about Roman virtue, right? Maybe this individual was valiant, but maybe not just, right? Maybe he wasn't in it for the right reasons. Could be what we're getting from this.
Right,
Uh,
and that might explain why this is strange, right? Why would David depict this story knowing that Horatius, I don't know who Horatius is, but probably part of the story, right? That Horatius was not really like the most virtuous guy, right? Justice of of his cause probably refers to virtue. So held more in admiration for his valiant exploits. Exploits isn't necessarily a bad word, right? That just means accomplishments, right? Like what you do. So valiant is like courageous, a courageous exploit. So he's more known for his courage than for his virtue, right? His
mhm.
justice of his cause. That's weird. That's a weird way of saying virtue, but that's probably the same thing here. Okay, cool.
Okay. And the next sentence begins with honestly, some of my favorite words in all of Cars, which is, in other words, yes, explain what you mean in more common language. So, in other words, while patriotic, Horatius had shown a notable lack of one of the main Stoic virtues, self-control in the face of provocation. So here we call back to virtues. Jack, you're totally right. Horatius doesn't have one of these key virtues, and we say it's self control in the face of provocation. So Horatius lacks self control. That's the virtue that he doesn't have. And maybe that is why he was an odd choice for this guy, David, to depict in his art.
Right. And so what we can assume is that the author believes depiction should probably be of that of virtuous stuff, right? Specifically
Mhm.
self-control. That's the definition of virtue in the author's eyes so far, right? Now again, if you're reading this and you have no idea who Horatius is, right, and you know nothing about Roman times and virtue, you might be panicking, but neither do we. We don't know anything about it. It's not like we read this stuff all day, every day, or at
Mhm.
all, right? And so it's not about knowing everything. You have to be comfortable not knowing everything and just sticking to whatever they say and picking it up. It's sort of like a puzzle, right? You're reading for more clues, more context clues. And you made a great point. When they say in other words, they're clearing up what they already said, right?
Mhm.
Putting it in more common person language that everyone can understand. So, yeah, great.
Love it. Okay, well, let's finish up this very first paragraph with one last sentence. It says, but the story of the Horatii did contain one feature which was in perfect accord with David's 18th century morality, and moreover displayed a characteristic Roman virtue in its finest form. It finishes, it says, the selfless resolve of three youths to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their country. Okay, so this sentence now is saying something that is quite different from before, right? We talked previously about how this lacks virtue. It lacks the virtue of self-control. But now we're kind of changing our tune and saying, actually, it really does display one particular Roman virtue, and that's essentially self-sacrifice. Um, what I found interesting while reading this is the change in the tone and the word choice. Jack, what did you think about that?
Oh yeah, look out for contrast words. But yet, however, right? Huge,
Mhm.
huge on the MCAT. And we pivoted. We completely pivoted to there is virtue in David's
Mhm.
draw in this story and in David's depiction because it says David's 18th century morality. So David's refers to what the actual sketch, right? Like that's the only thing David has, right? And so absolutely. I mean, like this is the whole point of Cars is can you read and find what the author really cares about? And there's no denying that if you didn't understand anything you read, up until this point, that's okay, as long as you understood this sentence. Because this sentence is easy to understand, especially the very last clause, right? The
Mhm.
selfless resolve of three youths, okay, we know who those are, those three brothers, to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their country. That's the virtue, right? You're sacrificing yourself for your country, right? And so that's it. I mean, if you focus on the fact that, hey, David did depict this story because of, the fact that there was some virtue, and that virtue is selflessness, you're gold. You know everything you need to know about this paragraph.
Perfect. All right. So, coming out of paragraph one, keeping this idea in mind that David did demonstrate this, or Horatius, this story did demonstrate that Roman virtue of self sacrifice, we can move into our second paragraph, which would begin in the end. David decided to depict the moral sacrifice of the three young men rather than their father's morally dubious plea for Horatius. Okay, so the first half of that sentence sounds exactly like what we just said, right? The self sacrifice is the virtue that is being demonstrated here. I don't know about the father's morally dubious plea. Um, I don't really know where they're going with that, but I understand the beginning, all right? And it's continuing what we talked about. So for me, I'm just thinking, all right, if they characterize the morally dubious plea, I'll understand it better. But at least I understand the first half of this sentence, which is how David depicted the scene.
Great. There's nothing else here. I understand the whole father's morally dubious plea for Horatius. Okay, so Horatius is the guy that, I mean, we know that because the H is capitalized, right? It's a noun here, right?
Mhm.
Father's dubious plea. So dubious means doubtful. So father's doubtful plea. Again, this is really confusing, but that doesn't matter because it's saying rather than their father. So
Mhm.
on the same trajectory. We're not changing what we're talking about. You see, when you're reading, your job is to identify important sentences, right? But as you're reading, if you don't see a really important argument or sentence, then assume that we're still talking about the same stuff. And that's what's happening here. We're still talking about more or less the same thing, right? This idea of moral sacrifice that David
Mhm.
decided to depict. So
Mhm.
you should, it's hard because it's easy for our brains to just zone out and clock out and just go, okay, I'm lost, right? But if you're constantly asking yourself, what's going on? What are we reading? Why is this different from what I've already read? Then you'll be more actively engaged in the reading process. And so I think
Yeah.
this is just a matter of willpower, right? Continue.
Yes.
Don't give up. Go ahead.
Okay. Another drawing shows David's initial depiction of the story, which focuses on the same value. So now we're talking about another initial drawing, right? Maybe a different work by the same guy, David, which focuses on the same value. We might start to talk about that other depiction, but it sounds like it's showing the same thing that we've been talking about. So here I'm saying, okay, thank you. Please discuss this initial depiction. I'm wondering where are we going in this paragraph, but trying not to feel lost, right? We have things to anchor as far as what came before, right? It's continuing that same idea. I'm just interested to know where this paragraph is going to go from here.
Right. Some new drawing, right? Another
Mhm.
drawing. But same thing. It's showing the same value, same selflessness, right? More like that's the virtue that we've been talking about. Okay.
All right. Our next sentence says, here, the father is arming his three sons and sending them into battle. So it sounds like this is what this new drawing is just physically showing. So we get the father arming his sons, setting him into battle. I could visualize that, not getting a ton of other information from this sentence.
Great.
All right, let's read the next one. It says this incident is not described by Livy, but by a lesser known historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Okay, cool. The story is changing in its storyteller or author, right? But it's still seemingly the same subject that we've been describing before.
Right. Now it's giving us, this story from someone else, not Livy from Dionysus, right? And
Mhm.
so we're still, nothing's really changing, just giving us more context. Go ahead.
Mhm. Okay, so he tells us that the Horatii, when asked by the king to fight the enemy, refused to go out into battle unless their father approved. So we're kind of telling this story sentence by sentence here. Um, so sons are refusing until they have their father's approval.
Right, you can just imagine this, right? Visualize this, like they're like, no, 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 but then they're looking at their father for approval. Okay.
Hmm. Okay, when asked for permission, and we get quotes here, their father, upon learning their resolve, rejoiced and lifting his arms up to heaven, said he rendered thanks to the gods for giving him such noble sons. End quote. Again, this is a very easy to visualize paragraph. We're describing the subject of the drawing in detail. We can see the father lifting up his arms and saying thank you. But again, just kind of finishing out this picture of what David was drawing.
Great.
And then we finish up paragraph 2 and we say, accordingly, the sons go out into battle. So they go.
Yeah. So
Um,
they got the approval, right?
yes.
Now, it's interesting because it says such noble sons. So
Mhm.
noble as in, okay, well, if you end up going to battle, right, then you're virtuous, right? You're
Mhm.
self-sacrificing. So set kind of in the same context that we've been talking about.
Yes.
Very
Yeah, it's basically a continuation of that last idea, like we talked about in paragraph 1.
right, right. And so this is just giving us more information, more context as to what's going on, but it does introduce a new like art, right? New depiction. And it gives us
Mhm.
a good visualization. I think, you could probably Google and find this piece of art. Look at it afterwards. Read the story, right? Understand the story and watch, look at the art. That's what I love about art passages is because you know nothing about the art, right? Tech usually, but then you go and read the article and then you learn more about it and then you can Google it and say, okay, yeah, I got it. That's where it is. And usually these paintings are in museums, right? Like the Louvre.
Mhm.
So it's pretty cool. Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. It makes cars a lot more fun when you can look it up and see what it was being described.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at paragraph number 3. It says, it is true that there is in Dionysus no mention of any oath, but in all other respects, his account corresponds to this drawing and to David's later painting, Oath of the Horatii. So now we're talking oaths. There's not an oath in the story, but otherwise, this painting that probably was the painting we started out discussing in paragraph 1, right? Oath of the Horatii fits the story. So we're describing that other than the oath, right? This is accurate,
Yes,
basically.
that's exactly it. Right. Okay.
Okay, let's see. So the old man's raised arms, his looking up to heaven, must have been suggested to the artist by the classical author. So, again, something we could definitely visualize. It sounds like we're saying Dionysus kind of suggested this to David, um, which is very interesting. It sounds like it's an argument. It must have been suggested, but can't imagine these two having a conversation about this. I don't know about you, Jack.
Yeah, yeah, this is definitely an argument because we don't know. There's no factual evidence to know what has been suggested and what hasn't. Suggested it means inspired, by the way. Must have
Hmm.
been inspired to the artist, right? So the artist got this drawing from somewhere, right? This idea from somewhere. And so the author is saying, okay, yeah, this artist, David, they had to get their inspiration from Dionysus in this case for this specific art, right? This Oath of the Horatii. Okay.
Okay, one last sentence in paragraph 3 here. Moreover, bearing in mind the moral implications of the Horatii story, David fixed on the climactic moment and shows an action which can be made clear through gestures and expressions alone. So it sounds like we are again making an argument of what David did, right? David decided to pick this moment because it's the climax of the story, and therefore maybe maybe presumably exciting. And it's something that maybe is easy to paint or draw, right? Because it's very visual, is what it sounds like. But again, I'm thinking to myself, is this David saying why he fixed on it? Or is this the author basically explaining for David why he did this? Right? That would
Right.
definitely be an argument.
Right. This is not the clearest sentence, but we're definitely talking about, what the author, excuse me, what David kind of depicted, right? This climactic moment, right? Where there's a lot of hand gestures or expressions. But
Mhm.
yeah, so far so good. I mean, all we need to know from this paragraph is what?
It sounds like we're describing this oath of Horatii, right? And we're talking about how it's similar to what Dionysus said, right? And characterizing why he chose that moment.
Great. That's it. Basically, just know this is a kind of paragraph that kind of sits on its own, right? And
Mhm.
you may be thinking, well, what's the point of this sentence, of this paragraph? It's because they're going to ask questions about it potentially, right? Like,
Mhm.
where did David get his inspiration from? Oh, from Dionysus.
Mhm.
And so that might not seem like it has a larger connection to the whole passage, but it doesn't have to. Sometimes you'll read a paragraph that kind of stands on its own, right? And that's what's happening here. All I would pick out from this is, okay, there's some painting, Oath of Horatii, that David did draw, right, or depict, and that was inspired by Dionysus' story. Even though there's no mention of an oath, everything else is pretty much the same,
Mhm.
story wise. And so, I mean, I don't think even that is that important, but yeah,
Yeah.
knowing that there's a connection between David and Dionysus is, I think, enough.
Yeah. So not every paragraph is going to tell you something absolutely critical. I love that you bring up that point. Let's see if paragraph 4 does. So, paragraph 4 says, but why did David introduce the motive of the oath of the three brothers, which is not mentioned in any of the classical sources at his disposal? So, now actually, we kind of get why they introduced the fact of, Dionysus didn't mention an oath, but otherwise it's accurate. We're asking why? Why did he introduce this new thing of this oath? Why would he do that? I'm
Right.
now curious why, since you asked me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's no mention of the oath anywhere, but then somehow, there's some oath depiction, right? And so we want to know why. Why? How did David come up with this? Okay, cool.
Mhm. Okay, an artist as well versed in the in the classics as David would have known many examples of oath swearing, and the ancient authors are full of stories about oaths sworn to fight for one's country, come what may. So basically, it sounds like we're saying oaths are pretty common in the classics. So maybe that's where he got that inspiration.
Yeah, so classics, but what is an oath? What do we do? What kind of oath are we swearing into? Exactly. To do what?
To fight, it sounds.
To
To
fight,
fight for your country.
right? Which is that moral virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And
Self-sacrifice.
so it's not clear yet, but it seems
Mm-hmm.
like going back to that self-sacrifice virtue stuff, and the author is making that the point of this passage because it's repeating. When you see a repeating theme, that's important, right? I mean, that was
Mm-hmm.
in the first paragraph, that was in the second paragraph. It wasn't in this third paragraph because the third paragraph was all about how, okay, David depicted an oath, even though Dionysus didn't talk about an oath, right? And ultimately he was still inspired by Dionysus, which is a weird, like, kind of offshoot off what we've been talking about. But here we are talking about the oath now in the same context as the virtues, right? Going into this
Mm-hmm.
idea of self-sacrifice. So interesting. Okay, let's keep going.
All right. The most celebrated example, which also inspired many painters, is the oath of Brutus and friends over the body of the defiled Lucretia. So it sounds like this is another situation where we have an oath being sworn to fight for someone's country, right? They
Right.
haven't said that they're fighting for a country, but They're saying this is a celebrated example, so I'm expecting that's where we're going.
Right, celebrated, right? So this is probably a virtuous thing that everyone should aspire to. And this is just another example of some story, or art form that shows this. Right now, do I
Mhm.
need to know who Brutus and friends are or Lucretia is? No, you don't, right? And don't freak out if you don't know what defiled means, right? But like it's sort of going in the same direction, okay?
Okay, short little sentence. That oath is how the Roman Republic came into being. So, this is a celebrated example for a reason. That oath is how the Roman Republic came into being. So, it's important.
Important, yeah. Yeah, because the oath is so important, that self-sacrifice is so important, right? That fighting for your country, that it helped born a country, right?
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, the last sentence says David too wanted his oath to remind viewers of the limits of tyranny and what it means to fight for a republic. Finally, we bring this back to David. I don't know about you, but Jack, but when I read this, I was like, punching the air out of joy. Like, finally, this is pretty direct. This is what David's oath was for. And it's stated pretty clearly, right? Remind viewers of the limits of tyranny and what it means to fight for a republic. Fight for your country, fight for the republic, fight against tyranny. That's what the oath was about.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because we kept reading and none of it was really clear until the last sentence. And I can
Mhm.
imagine a student asking right now, is that always the case? Is it always the last, like, should I just keep reading and until I read the last sentence of each paragraph? Will it always clear it up? No. Every
Mhm.
author is different. Sometimes they'll make it very obvious in the very first sentence of each paragraph. Sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's at the end. My point is you never know. You just have to keep going, right?
Mhm.
And you'll find it somewhere. Right.
Mhm.
You'll never know. It might be at the beginning. It might be at the end. It just happened to be at the end for this passage, at least a couple times in this passage, right?
Mhm.
And so let's break down that sentence. David too wanted his oath to remind viewers of the limits of tyranny. Okay, limits of tyranny is a little difficult to understand. But because what are we like? What tyranny are we talking about? Limiting like what
Mhm.
tyranny? But the part that really makes sense is and what it means to fight for a republic. So that fighting for a republic, that self-sacrifice, that virtue, that Roman virtue is coming back here, right? Again,
Mhm.
talking about David's depiction to inspire the audience to fight. Okay, cool.
Mhm. Awesome. So let's start our final paragraph, paragraph number 5. It says the oath of the Horatii was shown in Paris 4 years before the onset of the French Revolution. Okay, so rather than talking about the painting itself and what was going on in the story that the painting is depicting, now we're getting the painting itself, the Oath of Horatii. Where was this displayed? Right? We're time jumping from ancient Rome to the French Revolution. So it seems like maybe we'll talk about this painting's impact or something about the time when it was painted rather than when the story occurred.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's take a look. It says it is a veritable paradigm of moral history painting. And then we see this uh, semicolon. It extols civic virtue in personal terms, but makes no allusion, overtly or otherwise, to any of the political issues of the day. This is a sentence that if I was reading it when I took my exam a couple years ago, would terrify me. There's a lot going on in here. Jack, do you think a sentence like this is critical to our understanding of the passage?
No, but you still need to try to understand it. The key is have courage and,
Hmm.
and don't give up, right?
Hmm.
And because you understand enough. I mean,
Hmm.
you know what's going on. You be
Hmm.
confident based on that. It is a veritable paradigm of moral history painting. I have no idea what that means.
Yes.
Veritable means actual. Paradigm is some sort of like system. So it's an
Hmm.
actual system or actual like
Representation.
representation, yeah, of moral history. Okay, so it represents moral history painting. It's a good example of a moral history. I have, but the problem is I just don't know what moral history painting is.
Exactly.
The moral, maybe that's like the virtuous stuff that they were talking. I really don't know. It extols, okay. Extols is kind of hard to understand in this context, but sure. Civic virtue in personal terms, but makes no allusion. So it exemplifies civic virtue, but makes
Mhm.
no allusion, meaning reference, no passing reference, overtly or otherwise. Okay, okay, that's really weird. To any of the political issues. So it's just not relevant to today's political issues? Is that what it's
Yeah.
like? Again, it's not clear, right?
Yeah.
But let's keep going. Let's see what else they say.
Yeah. Hopefully it clears it up. So our next sentence says, still, David's audience could easily infer from the ancient situation to their own. So the only piece of the sentence that came before that kind of made sense to me was the fact it makes no allusions to the political issues of the day, right? To me, that's the only part that made sense. And it's maybe saying like this story about Rome is not directly addressing the basically the French Revolution or the situation in France, but this sentence is saying, but actually we can connect to it, right? The
Yeah.
community that is seeing this painting can connect to it, even though it's not supposed to be modern. It's not supposed to show the French Revolution. You see yourself in the painting. That's kind of what I'm pulling out of this.
This is what authors do, right? They bring up something to kind of like make it seem like they're neutral by suggesting that, hey, look, it might not be relevant. And that's exactly what happened in the first paragraph, right?
Hmm.
Oh, look, this might be strange.
Hmm.
And the reason why they do that is because it makes the author seem like they're way more impartial, meaning
Hmm.
they're thinking this through well. They understand both sides, and that's what confuses students because they would just want to know what's the point, and they don't realize that when you're reading a conversation, and usually the conversation goes back and forth, right? It's not always just one side. And so the author is trying to convince you, the reader, that they are knowledgeable about this painting and their points are valid because they've thought through the counterpoints, right? In this case, well, it might not be relevant to society today, right? Or like in the first paragraph, oh yeah, this might be strange, because it doesn't represent courage or whatever about Horatius, right? I mean, it wasn't or whatever the first paragraph was talking about in terms of self-control, right? It doesn't show the self-control virtue, right?
Hmm.
But we're probably going to get the point of this paragraph soon. And so we got to just read as if we don't know the point yet because the author hasn't made it clear.
Hmm.
Okay.
All right. We have one last sentence of this whole passage. It says, David's oath was the same as the one they were meant to take, to fight for their country, even if it meant losing their lives, and to make sure a new country, republic, came into being from the ashes of the tyranny which governed them. Okay, this now sounds very familiar. It sounds like self-sacrifice. It sounds like limitations of tyranny and fighting for a new republic. This is this is exactly the same situation that we were given in the story of the Horatii, but now it seems like maybe the author's saying that's part of why David chose that story, right? We're almost kind of addressing our paragraph one question of, it might be weird that he chose this story to tell, right? Why did they choose this story to tell? Sounds like this last sentence kind of explains that for us.
Exactly. Exactly. This is going back to the previous paragraph, right? The whole, like you said, limits of tyranny. So limits of tyranny, because you don't want to be, remember, when you're fighting for your country, you're fighting for your freedom, right? You don't
Mhm.
want to be controlled by another country, right? And so they're saying if you have self-sacrifice, you limit tyranny. You stop tyranny, right? And that's a virtue on its own, right? You fight for your republic, for your freedom, right? And so this is interesting because the author is suggesting that Horatio, the Oath of Horatii, this painting was shown in Paris 4 years before the onset of the revolution. Why? Because the revolution was occurred to limit tyranny and to fight for your freedom, right? At least that's what most revolutions are for, right? You're
Mhm.
fighting to against the government. You're trying to gain some sort of freedom, some sort of advantage in your life, right? And so
Mhm.
the author is pointing out that look, this painting was shown during the French Revolution or right before the French Revolution because just like any fight you go into, you need to have self-sacrifice, right? And this is just to prove their point of look, this painting by David, right, was meant to inspire the audience to fight for a republic, to kind of,
Mhm.
do that self-sacrifice, right? That
Mhm.
the author brought up in the first two paragraphs. And so it
Mhm.
kind of all connects. It
Mhm.
all should make sense because what's going on is the author's explaining what this painting is about, right? And if we know that, then we should be able to answer most of these questions with ease.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that was a beautiful summary of our sort of our main idea, like our main point of this passage. Yeah, I completely agree. That being said, like you said at the very beginning, this passage was not an easy read. Um, what if we had to summarize some of the advice that we gave, right, for a student that is reading a passage like this on test day? What can they do to make sure they just get through it? What would you advise for them?
Yeah, I would say the best advice is obviously practice. Practice these kinds of passages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Art passages. This is an art passage.
Mm-hmm.
Practice what you don't like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be uncomfortable practicing now so that when you're on the test, you're comfortable, right? The other
Yeah.
thing is when you're sitting there doing this test and you see really hard sentences, you should smile. You should laugh because you should know that there's no way that 99 or 100% of students reading this passage will understand everything. That's by design,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That's how this test is designed. It's designed in a way to see if you can pick up the most important points, right? And the most important point, the main idea, I want to clarify this for anyone who's curious. It's that David's painting was meant to inspire, the audience to self-sacrifice, to fight for their country, right? That's the main idea, and that was established very deeply in the last two paragraphs. And so, my advice is there are layers. Each paragraph will give you some context, some layer. It might not be the deepest layer, right? But as you keep reading, that layer will become more and more clear, whether it's in the same paragraph or in later on in the same in the passage, right? The layers got clearer and clearer and deeper at the end of this passage. And so the last two paragraphs really established the argument of the passage. Although that theme of virtue, that theme of self-sacrifice was important throughout the entire passage, right, in every paragraph we read. Um,
Yes.
and so yeah, and so this is a very good example of what the MCAT will do, which is present to you 4 or 5 arguments, 4 or 5 points that you need to pick up in a passage where you don't understand the context fully, you don't understand half of what they're talking about, right? They don't explain it well, and we don't know what's going on, but that doesn't mean you should panic. That just means you should keep going.
Absolutely. And I love how different this passage was from the one that came before. And that's our goal with these CARS reading skills workshops is to show you how different passages can be, and yet the way that you read them is the same, right? That's what we aim to teach our students every time we start talking about CARS is ultimately the same strategies apply to every passage. So if you enjoyed our episode today, definitely check out the one that we did previously called The Hunting Grounds. And be sure to tune in for our next one. We're trying to put these out every week. So we hope you enjoy them and find value in them. Um, and we hope you come back for the next one. Have a
Awesome.
wonderful rest of your day or week or whenever you're listening. And we hope to see you again soon.